Well, thank you for coming. My name is Mike Foy. I'm a retired DNR wildlife biologist, and now trying to be fairly active with Wisconsin's Breeding Fire, which is sponsoring our presentation. In case you're not familiar with that organization, they're largely made up of retired resource and science professionals, so people from all walks of specialty. And probably the one thing we have in common is we no longer have to worry about getting fired if we speak our mind. So that's kind of our guiding light, and it's really nice. You guys will all enjoy that someday, I'm sure. So it's good to be a regular citizen again. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen to kind of let us know where this might fit into what you guys are all about.
Hey, I'm Karen Mesmer, some of you in here, and I taught in Baraboo and in Alaska, and now I'm a science ed consultant since I retired 7 years ago, working with them. And I'm working with Green Fire now, Wisconsin's Green Fire. And so the handout gives you a little bit of an idea how you might use this in the classroom. We're going to do two very short activities with you trying to see, okay, how can I use this information that Mike is going to give you in the classroom? So just a reminder that the two main things that students should be doing in a classroom are figuring out and making sense. Not just you telling them, but having them figure things out. And it should start with a phenomenon. And then you'll be using the disciplinary core ideas, which for the middle school, I put those at the bottom of the page and the next page, and the high school on the following page. You're not going to use all of those, but I just picked the ones that I thought most related to chronic wasting disease, and you can pick whatever ones fit with your curriculum and what you might want to use. And then the science and engineering practices, we're going to do a few of these today, and then the cross-cutting concepts to tie them all together. So here's our first phenomenon. So take a look at this picture here and think for a minute, what do I wonder about this? And what questions do I have about this phenomenon right here? And so I want you to write on that little sticky one question that you have. I have over here on the chart paper our driving question for this unit. What's happening with deer in Wisconsin? So one question for each of you on the sticky that you have. So we want to get kids to ask questions. I don't think I ever was asked to come up with a question until I got to grad school in any of my science classes. I was told exactly what questions we were going to look at.
Karen, does the question need to be about this specific photograph?
About this phenomenon right here. Something that you wonder about this picture. Here's a deer there. So what do you notice about that deer? And then what question might you have about it?
Stick it up there.
And then when you're done, come up here, one or so at a time, and just loudly say what your question is. Don't talk over each other. Go ahead and say what your question is and put it up on our driving question board.
I said, what caused this white-tailed deer to become so thin?
And you might have a similar question. If you do, you can say that, but then put it right at the bottom of the mic. So we kind of group questions together.
Why is this deer so skinny?
Why is deer malnourished?
I said, why does this deer look so thin?
Where is this?
Why are the deer's ribs showing?
Why does the deer appear comfortable walking into a regular yard?
Where's the photo taken? It's clearly in the landscape.
What are some solutions to deer overpopulation in Wisconsin?
What part of the state was this deer from?
Many of you wondered, why it's so thin, what's up with this deer? Some of you wondered where this was happening in the state. What can we do with overpopulation of deer? So we've got some questions that we can come back to answer if you were teaching this in a classroom, to get kids to think, these are my questions, this is what I thought of, and we're going to try and answer them now. And Mike is going to give you some background information.
So, those were some great questions, and they're going to kind of keep them in mind as we go through, because they'll be part of what we discuss. There was a number about the apparent poor condition of the deer, and this is what they call a clinical deer. It's got chronic wasting disease, which is a progressive neurological disease, and it's in the final stages of its life, the last weeks or months at most. And you can see some of the classic symptoms. Ribs are showing. They call that a razor spine, where it's so thin that the spine is just sticking up. They call that a hip pointer. You can almost see the bone poking through. And the behavior is very characteristic. They end up with just an insatiable thirst towards the end. And someone asked, why is this deer so comfortable coming right into someone's back patio? Which is not completely uncommon in parts of the state, but it is a clear characteristic of this disease that at the end they lose all fear, people lose all awareness of what's going on around them. People have somewhat inaccurately called them zombies, but I mean it's a very sad way to go. And it is related to other diseases that you may have heard of, like mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob in humans. It's probably one of the most miserable ways that I could think of to end your time on Earth, because it takes months or years for this to happen. And while that is going on, they're shedding these malformed proteins called prions, which we'll talk about in a second why that is a particular problem in this disease. And I think we're going back to the old-fashioned way here. So this is just a map of how it showed up in the country and in the world, in fact, in Colorado. And it does not work either. So we're going to skip that. I'll suffice to say that it started in one area near Fort Collins, and it is now spread to 29 states in wild populations and another one in captive birds. And basically this whole central part of the nation is now colored red, with a few out to the East Coast. Yep.
Do they know the origin of it? I've heard something about possible research facilities that may have gotten.
Well, it was first discovered in a research facility at Colorado State, I believe. But the origins are unclear. I think the prevailing view is that these prion diseases are called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So if any of you are spelling teachers, then good one to take home. But they have been known from sheep called scrapie for 300 years or more. And I think there's some thought that and they're very hard to go from one species group to another, but once they figure out how to do it, then it speeds up. So I think the prevailing view is that sheep offal, meat packing waste, whatever, was ground up into protein feed that was fed to cattle, and then cattle ended up getting it. And They don't know the exact pathway, but I think the prevailing thought is it probably is a version of scrapie that got from sheep into deer family. But it happened on a research facility, but it wasn't, to my understanding, associated with the research that was going on there. So, this one I know will work because it's more, I got all the slides in. So that's where we first found it in the 3 samples from the 2001 deer season. And that happens to be, was my work territory at the time. So I've been involved in this for pretty much the last half of my DNR career and then on into retirement. 3 deer, and just remember how small that is. So next year, part of this is just because we're now really looking for it. We had one vet tech that just happened to take some samples because she was curious, and she probably saved us many years of getting farther behind on this, just because of her diligence. But here's the next year, and then it just keeps spreading and growing in prevalence. And again, remember it started with that one little spot. So here's one little spot. These are a square mile. Here's one little spot. What's it going to be in another 20 years? And in fact, this is just the southern, mostly the southwest corner of the state. Everything shaded in gray there is now considered CWD affected, which is a confusing term because it's not necessarily infected. The definition under the legal language is where a wild or captive deer was found to be positive, or any county with a wild or captive positive deer, and any county within 10 miles of that location. So you can see now that there's only a few areas left that are white, meaning they're farther than 10 miles from a positive detection. And so we have, lots of little things that are no different than what was in western King County in the town of Vermont 22 years ago at a meeting similar to this for our professional society. They came in and announced it. It rocked our world because prior to that, it had not been found any closer than 800 miles to the west in Colorado and Wyoming and Nebraska. And all of a sudden it's over here, and what do we do? So there's still a lot of questions. Will CWD actually threaten deer populations like it is in western states? We have a much more productive deer herd here, so we're probably going to be somewhat more resilient. But we're waiting on results from a big $3 million study that was going to try and answer that question about whether we're going to start losing our deer to disease. What about the human health risks? So we've been finding about 1,500 positive deer a year. Well, we harvest about 300-some thousand every year in Wisconsin, and only 10% of the deer in the counties that we know have it get sampled. So, a very crude, simple extrapolation would indicate that there are thousands of sick deer going into people's freezers, being fed to their families, and often without knowing about it, and it's kind of a big, giant experiment going on. Many of those deer are going through local butcher shops in small towns all across the state, and they follow, beef and pork, and now they switch to deer for a few weeks in the fall. But if any of you have ever tried to, clean a grinder, it is very difficult to do, and I think somewhat questionable how much separation there is of events than the more regular meats that people use. They now know that there'll be environmental contamination. These prions are very long-lasting, years potentially in the soil, and very hard to break down. You have to actually put them in a very high temperature, almost like a plasma incinerator to break them down. Just normal, autoclaving, things like that doesn't do it. Yes?
Does cooking the meat destroy the prions?
No. But, the good news there is most of them are in the nervous system, not in the meat, but they have found them in meat tissue now at very low densities. But, like I mentioned, there's a very strong species threshold or species, like a family threshold. But once it figures out how to get across it, then things speed up. So the human health risks are still unknown, but I want to just say that so far nobody has ever confirmed that people have gotten anything related to CWD, any kind of TSD disease from eating venison.
Mike, I just wanted to say the previous presenter, as she was leaving, told me that there's a professor at UW Stevens Point that's working on composting.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you know about this, the carcasses and
Yep.
looking at destroying the prions through
Yep.
a special
That's one avenue that's being considered is, I think it's not so much the heat, but the time. I've not heard of any final results from that yet. A big question we get a lot is, will selection select for CWD resistant genotypes? Probably yes, but the key word here is resistant. So they're not immune from CWD, they just takes them a few months longer to become infected, and they live a few months longer. But they still get it, and it's invariably fatal when they do. So you have no recovered class to have immunity, which is, we've heard all this from COVID. We're depending on the fact that people who recover have a certain amount of immunity. That doesn't happen here. And the other thing is, these are not fruit flies. These animals live, anywhere from 6 months to 9, 10, 11, 12 years or more. So when they say that selection will change, we're talking potentially hundreds of years rather than, 25 generations in a single year in the lab. Now I know that the captive deer industry is trying to see if they can selectively breed for this, but right now there's very little hope for a natural resistance to it. And finally, can an effective vaccine be developed? We've been just almost overwhelmed with the discussion about the COVID vaccine and trying to get people to take advantage of it. Well, in this case, imagine these are, you got to deliver this out across the landscape of Wisconsin and try and figure out who got it and who didn't, and are raccoons going to come and eat that whole, if you put it in a bait, are they going to put it in there before? And then you have the issues of, people use these for food. So now you're putting a drug into an animal that's used for food, which, can be approved, but it often takes years of testing and verification that it's safe. So the whole thing about is COVID safe, COVID vaccine safe, well, we're talking years. And the last thing, it's not a bacteria and it's not a virus. Prions are proteins that we all have in our bodies naturally. They get misshapen or they get misshapen in deer, but the immune system doesn't really recognize them as being foreign. So what is it? What's going to start ringing the alarm bell, right? So I'm going to speed this up a little bit, but suffice to say, for those of you that aren't really involved in deer hunting and stuff, but it's a big deal in Wisconsin. Some of you from northern school districts probably are aware of kids that take that whole week off if they can get away with it. But
That's me.
we're well over $1 billion in the annual economic impact of Wisconsin deer season, and 15,000 jobs. I mean, it's a big thing. And then you start thinking, well, what about the tribal impacts, because they consider deer such an important part of their culture. The ecosystem advantages or benefits. Deer are, if you don't have deer, you're probably not going to have wolves, for example, which some people might like, but they're a huge part of the food chain. Real estate values. I estimate that good deer hunting probably adds $1,000 an acre to the value of land, unless it's primarily just going to be a development land or very intensive agriculture. So if deer hunting goes away or gets seriously diminished, what's that going to do to real estate values? And if your real estate values fall, what does that do to the property tax base, which pays for the schools that you guys are working? So it could have a huge impact. This number here could be a drop in the bucket compared to when we finally start to figure what all this might have effect on local government's ability to raise money. And it's really easy for a town government to, if property values are increasing, they can keep their mill rate the same but get more money, right? Because they keep the same assessment, but the valuation they're applying to goes up. Well, you start to reduce property values and have them consistently fall, then it gets a really hard time to be a town chair because you're trying to make up the lost revenue when people are feeling less wealthy because their land is worthless. So, I'm going to turn it back to Karen and just say, this is a bigger thing than it might appear at first glance.
Okay, question there.
Is there a way to, I know we're working with DNA manipulation to create a virus that would target those prams specifically to give them some sort of antigen that would make the white blood cells see them as something foreign?
So that just went about a mile over my head. It's an interesting idea. I have no idea if that would be possible. I have not. I read as much of the CWD literature as I can, and I have not heard of that being an approach, but there's a lot of smart people in this country, so we'll see.
Okay, so we started out with some questions that you came up with. Some of them have already been answered. Yes, that deer head, chronic wasting disease, and you may have kids have other questions like the ones that Mike presented. What about a vaccine? And you can have them put those questions up there and have them go research whatever questions they have. So by now, how many of you think that chronic wasting disease in the deer population in Wisconsin is a problem? Thumbs up or hands up if you think it's a problem. So, okay, it looks like we're all in agreement about that. So, do you have any ideas about what we can do about this problem? Maybe you've heard something at home, maybe you've read something in the news, maybe you just have come up with something off the top of your heads right now. So I want you to think for a minute by yourself about that. What can we do here in Wisconsin about chronic wasting disease? Hey, let's come back together. And I heard some very good discussions here, and one of the things that deer that, that test positive, and that some, this group was talking about, not many of the deer actually get tested, and what can we do with something like that? So that is the next part of our presentation.
So, there's been a lot of talk. There's a whole lot of people working at the biological level, genetic level. But right now, we don't have anything that works except somehow trying to weed those sick deer out of the population. When we first got going on this in 2002, we thought, well, we just bring the whole population down to a very low level, and that will break the chain of transmission, and then we'll be okay. Well, it threw us for a loop because it turns out that CWD is primarily a frequency-dependent transmission disease, not a density-dependent, which is, again, kind of over my head, but long and short, if you bring a population down just generally across the whole population and just reduce its density way down, you'll end up with a smaller but still sick population. So because it's frequency dependent, we gotta somehow try and get the sick deer out of there and allow the healthy deer to replace them, and hopefully keep as many of the healthy deer from getting sick because you reduce the source of infection. So it's you know, I like to think of it in some ways about weeding a garden. You know, you don't want to just go in and nuke the whole garden. You want to take out the things that you don't want and leave the stuff you do want. This is a deer that was shot by, turns out this is my replacement at DNR. She's the Dane County biologist now, and she was hunting on our farm, and you know, this was her first buck. And for those of you that aren't associated with deer hunting culture, that's a big deal in a lot of people's lives, and we ended up throwing the whole thing away because it was sick. So it's a very, you know, for one, you go to all the work of butchering the deer and wrapping it, and freezing it, and everything. I mean, we spent the whole Saturday afternoon on that in the cold garage, and then all for naught. So.
Were there any signs of it, or just the test came back positive?
Well, I mean, you can see it's a little thin. There's that tip pointer. It turned out it had a previous injury, so we thought, well, okay, it's not, you know, feeding efficiently, but the injury had nothing to do. I mean, it was underlying, it was sick with CWD. So we thought we had an explanation. At the time, this was only the second deer on our farm that had come back sick. Not this last fall, but the fall before, half of the deer that we harvested were sick. So, and you know, I'm going to be 66 this month. You know, trying to haul deer out of the driftless area when you're getting up there in age is, and only to find them, you know, if they're no good, really takes a beating on you. So how do we weed them out, however, when, you know, they only look like this the last few months at most, and often just weeks of you know, what could be a 2-year disease cycle or more is a really tough thing. It would be a lot easier if they, all the sick ones walked around like this, and we could say, oh, there's one, and we'll take that one out and leave all the healthy ones. Yeah.
If you see a deer like that when you're hunting, would you be able to take it and not have to use your tag on it? Do you know that?
So, sometimes if you were able to call a warden ahead of time and describe, but because that's often not possible, the way that the department has resolved that is you use your tag, but if it comes back sick, you get a replacement tag. So it's not exactly, it may not, you know, happen that same weekend, the opening weekend, but but ultimately we'll get a replacement. So yeah, too bad they don't have some, or there's not a big red X on them that we can all see. And I can tell you from being the person that had to go out and try and euthanize a lot of potentially sick deer, they don't always look real obviously sick. Someone asked a couple people where that first picture was. That was right out by Dodgeville in Iowa County. And my boss actually went and put that one down because it was just standing there. And many of them look like this. This is a certified trophy animal. I'm guessing that's about 220 pounds on the hoof, but fat. And it's just, when is it in the disease progression? They can be infected, but it's not putting them off their feed. It's not causing the wasting until some months, maybe a year later. So, unfortunately, for the most part, hunters can't tell. So it's the proverbial needle in a haystack problem. So I may be torturing this analogy, but so the deer in the haystack, most of them are healthy, some of them aren't. How do you get the sick ones out without laying waste to the entire deer population? And more generally, it's not just one haystack. There's thousands of sick deer out there now across the entire state, and all with their own little social groups. And how do you get them out of there? It is not an easy problem. So,
Okay.
first up, right there.
Okay, so, first of all, how many people ever played Battleship? Okay, is there anybody who need a little refresher? So, we'll do that maybe in the next slide. But you've got these little battleships here that are placed on your board, and your opponent tries to find out where your battleship is and blow it up. And so you're using some data that you collect about how big the ships are, about where you guess and where you get a correct guess, and then where maybe to guess the next coordinate. But one thing that Mike wanted to make sure I pointed out in this slide was the division of labor by gender in this picture. Notice who is playing the game and what the mother and daughter are doing in the kitchen.
And I like that you're so interested in what's going on.
Yeah, like what's going on out there. So hopefully this would be a way to engage kids thinking about this game. So, next slide.
Before we go on, I just want to say that this is just one aspect of the science behind CWD. There's some really high-power modeling going on, multiple trials where they do thousands of iterations of these trials. All the disease work, as far as figuring out what the thing is. We're just trying to focus on this one aspect, which is how do we find these things?
Right. So just to remember how you've got this grid and you're trying to guess where your opponent's ships are, and they're trying to guess where your ships are. And when you get a certain type of ship, you get so many points if you hit it. Was there something else you wanted to say about it? That you're not just guessing randomly? Yeah,
and I would just point out that because that different ships are different sizes, we may not have thought about it, but we're all using intuition when we're trying to figure out, well, where could a 5-square carrier fit in what's remaining on this map? And you're doing a process that we'll mention in a moment is at the base of all this.
Right, yeah, so next slide. So we are going to try to do this by the internet, if not, but there is this interactive map, and all these slides are going to be available on the website, but it's the DNR website that has all of this data by county, by township, and by section. And so remember that we started out, Mike showed us where this started, but it's available for your county no matter where you are around the state.
So you can immediately see there's squares there, and there's squares there. And this system dates back to the original surveyors, but it's the town range section. Each one of these squares is a 36 square mile, typically township, or town, as they call it in Wisconsin. And the DNR has data going down to not just a section, which is a square mile, but going down to the quarter section. So they have a lot of data, almost 300,000 samples in their database.
So the one that we're going to show you now is like right around here.
Yep, Sauk County.
Okay.
Apologize.
Okay, Amy, we're going to show Sauk County.
So think about right in the center there, and then I'm going to try and switch over.
Okay,
That's
think
it.
about the landscape and all of the features that you might consider when you're selecting where to take a sample. So when you're playing Battleship, you might choose by where you've already hit one and how big they are. But what other things might you consider in the landscape in how to take your sample?
Okay.
I was going to ask them while you're getting that.
I was saying, okay, I'm ready.
Yeah. Okay. Any other things you might consider in this landscape?
That's the town of Plain in Sauk County.
We're going to do this one right here.
And you can see the village of Plain up there in the corner.
So do you think you'd take a sample right in the middle of the city of Plain? Probably not. Probably not. There's probably not a lot of samples that were shot right there. What other things are in the landscape that you might consider and where to take your sample?
Obstacles, rivers, large roadways that might not have corridors to go over, travel over.
Okay.
Yep, there's the aerial photo that shows.
Topography.
Yep,
Okay.
it's right in the driftless and it's very rugged.
Land use too.
Land
So not
use?
land use.
Agriculture.
Okay. Where do you think you'd find more deer? What kind of land use do you think you'd find more?
They like hedges. So
Okay.
areas where there's open and covered.
Okay, great. And I think there was food, when there would be food. So food, think about their habitat needs. They need water, so maybe they are going to be found near some of the waterways. What about who owns the land? So I know there's one of the versions of the map where you can look at public versus private ownership. Are people hunting on public land?
Yeah, so there's not a lot in the town of Plain, but if you just go just south of it, you get the Lower Wisconsin Riverway, which shows up better. I go back
Anyway.
Oh, here's your DNR properties. So you have a lot of public land down there, which of course means that people have an easier time hunting there because they don't have to get permission from a private landowner. So often we see a lot of samples coming from public land, and we're actually doing a study right now to compare public versus private and see if the greater accessibility means that there's lower disease on public land than on private. So don't have results yet, but
Okay.
so back to the town of Plain.
Yeah. So now we're going to go by section, right?
Well, you're just
And
gonna just
Township.
think about, where you might think would be a good place to sample.
So where would you, if someone would be willing to, here's the van of white card, come up please and point to a section that you'd like to sample. Anybody? What section would you like to sample?
From one right over here. Oops. I'm thinking this one.
Okay, perfect. I have the,
I think in the interest of time, we better start to
Yeah,
show
let's do
the
it.
thing. And that is, so here's the samples by township. Oops, not by township, by section. That's where the samples were taken. So, you know, why do people sample some places heavier than others and some places not at all?
so these have a lot more samples taken.
And then here are the positives. This is all in 2019. Here's where they are. And some of these here were 80, 90, even close to 100% sick. So my point is that we had a couple of questions. I know Rich made one about where that first deer was located. And that's, you know, that's the key question is these animals are not, the sick animals are not, well, deer aren't either, but the sick animals are not uniformly spread across the landscape. And if you can find out where the sick ones are and go for those locations, you have a chance of getting them out at higher rates relative to healthy deer, which means you have a chance of reducing the problems.
Yeah, so can you click on his section and just show the data?
So, I gotta go back to,
Were equal numbers of deer sampled from each section?
no.
No.
That's the shades of brown and tan, darker it is.
But is that the positive? Is that the recognition of
That's
There's
like
a
a-
positive,
that's a
anything that's in
color.
pink or red had a positive, and,
Yeah. So the first slide, the previous slide, showed it was just different shades of brown and tan. That showed the number of samples. So the darker brown had more samples taken.
so I think we'll go back, just because the internet is very slow,
Yeah. Yeah, do
and
your-
I'll do, here's the results, and it basically shows all the first number up there in the fraction is the number of positives, the second is the number of samples, and then the frequency or prevalence is the fraction underneath. So anyways, you can mine this data out of, I mean, we couldn't do this in the early days, but now we got 300,000 samples, we can do this.
So no samples in this area. Here, 3 samples in this little area, and one of them was positive.
But why don't you point to that the blank one right there, right there, right there, right there.
This one?
Yeah, right next to an area that had 90% sick deer. You gotta figure that if any samples had been submitted from there, that some of them would be sick deer.
So that'd be a good place to take a sample.
So, going real fast now, this is pure hardcore science that we're just adapting. This guy was one of the few folks that worked this all out for the mineral exploration and oil and gas, basically making thunderstorm probability maps so that these drilling rigs can be put where there's something to get rather than someplace there isn't. Just putting one of these out there costs $5 million before you get a single ounce of oil or gas.
So it better be a pretty
So,
darn good guess.
Yep. And in fact, my brother-in-law was a petroleum job, as he's retired now, but that's what he did his entire career, is he told the folks where to go and put these, and he made a lot of money doing it. And it's basically a thunderstorm map, and we use it now. Back in 1988, we found a sidewheel steamer that had gone down off the coast of South Carolina in 1857, and they got all the data they could, including some of the information on currents, which had changed. The Gulf Stream had moved since this went down in a hurricane, and they programmed that all in, and they ended up finding it on their second try. And they had $300 million of gold in it, which they've been fighting over ever since with the insurance company. The U.S. Coast Guard uses this. They have extremely sophisticated search and rescue things where they get in as helicopters and ships transmit in, they get a search grid they've been assigned, and they transmit in that it's empty. That updates the probability map, and any place that hasn't been searched goes up higher in probability, and any place that has goes down lower. And and it's done in real time, which I think is the same as regular time, but it's interesting to me. And it's very effective at finding lost, sailors and such, and even, where you cannot see what's out there because it's underwater. They found airliners in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean using this stuff. So back to our problem, how do we do it? Well, how do we get hunters to harvest and sample more deer? And how do we get them, particularly to hunt where the geospatial statistics say that this is where they should be doing it? It doesn't, there's nothing wrong with deer hunting when there isn't sick deer, but we need people to go more for the sick ones and actually seek them out, similar to the way they look for a large trophy buck. So fortunately, we have lots of hunters still. We're, on opening weekend, we're equivalent to, depending on how you do, about the 8th largest standing army on earth. Basically, we're proposing to offer a reward, and there's going to be a question on the spring hearing next week, starting at 7 p.m. on Monday and going through 7 p.m. on Thursday. Everybody can vote if they feel so inclined, and it's a Natural Resources Board advisory question, and hopefully they'll let us do a pilot project to try and test this. And with all that,
Great. Yeah, I neglected to pass this
There
around.
is one that went around the sign-up
Yeah.
sheet. Okay, if there's anybody that has not signed up, that would be
Please.
great to.
Yeah, please sign up because we will.
there's some resources that when you get the video, you can access all these. And
Yeah.
thank you to Green Fire for sponsoring us.
Yes, so, and I just wanted to say a word about Green Fire, and I'll give you a little brochure. So, we are doing this on behalf of Wisconsin's Green Fire, which is an organization made up of natural resources professionals in various areas, from things like Mike, in wildlife management, to water quality, hazardous waste, air quality, pretty much any environmental issue that you should think of. A lot of them are retired or late career conservation professionals who are concerned about policy in Wisconsin and the decisions that we make that influence all of these things. And so we're trying to be a voice for sound science being used in those policies. And so we have people like Mike who are working on issues all around the state, and we have a lot of information. And so they prepare white papers and informational materials for legislators, for county and local officials to use in these kinds of decisions. Those same informational pieces are available to you on our website. And I've got an example here from our last little overview from the last 2 years of the different issues that we've worked on, from climate change, and there is a section in here on CWD that's got some of the data. So I encourage you to take one of these and look at all the different issues. And we're also willing to communicate with teachers, work with you if you've got your students involved in some kind of research or you want some data to analyze. We could get you some of